I talk to a lot of people online and stuff, and that's where they tell me, it's like, oh, well, I just, I don't have the time for this. I don't have the energy for this. I'm like, but if it was something that you were really interested in, or even like you said, even loosely interested in, instead of watching TV for 3 hours, you would sit down in front of your laptop and actually work, even if it's for half of that time.
Welcome to Latitude, the show for freelancers, founders, and creators about all the non-business parts of running a successful business. I interview folks who are defining work for themselves. We look at the mindset and methods it takes to create the latitude you need to do your most creative work. This week, I'm talking with Mubashar Iqbal, better known as Mubs. Mubs is a developer, maker, and indie hacker. He's been Product Hunt's Maker of the Year, has coded over 80 distinct projects, and some of them have gone completely viral, getting tens of millions of views. Somewhere in there, he also has a full-time job and a family. We talk about how to keep work fun and lighthearted. We talk about using self-imposed constraints to work more effectively. And then we look at how some of his own personal challenges and hobbies have informed some of his projects. Awesome. Well, welcome to the show, Mubs. Really excited to have you here. You've kind of like made more projects than probably the whole audience of this podcast combined. So I'm definitely really excited to talk with you. I guess to kind of kick it off, I'm curious what your very first exposure to coding was.
Yeah, I think I got my first kind of interest in coding was basically when my dad brought home a computer when I was about 8 years old. I was the youngest of 4 kids, so my siblings were a little bit older than me. And so my dad brought home a computer for them more than he brought it home for me. But then I was the one who was just on it all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then I just kind of started, just like tinkering with again, this is like back in 1982-ish, I guess. So it goes back a ways. And so back then, you didn't have this huge catalog of things that you could play and kind of install and stuff. So you end up having to write your own stuff a lot of the time. So I think I started just copying code from magazines into the computer so I could play a new game. And then I would just kind of tweak it a little bit so it worked or looked the way that I wanted it to. So that was kind of my first exposure, I think.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I mean, that sounds like fairly similar to mine. I definitely got into it at like almost the tail end of DOS games and like definitely like tweaking MySpace themes and stuff like that. And so then I guess how did that sort of lead to you've now gone on and created like so many projects? What was that like very first, what do you consider like your first like side project?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know what that label means exactly. I mean, I even when I was in high school, was really when I got into like the Linux world. And so I got my first exposure to like things like freeware and shareware and things like that. So that was kind of when that's the first time I think I wrote software and released it to somebody else. That wasn't just like me kind of hacking on stuff and just kind of saving it on my own local hard drive. And so that wouldn't be what you'd call a side hustle, I guess, back then. Because again, this is, back pre this whole side hustle craze that's kind of exploded recently. But that's probably my first exposure to really making stuff on the side, or just making stuff in my spare time, I guess. And then in terms of like actual side projects, I think, so once I had a job and I wasn't in school or, kind of stuff like that, I guess my first side hustle was when I was still in university. I was hired to build a currency conversion widget for a site. So I built a Java applet that somebody could embed on their website that would go and pull the currency rate. So you could type in that you had Great British pounds and you wanted a certain number of French francs or whatever it is, whichever currency that you're interested in. That was in 1995, I think, was my first kind of freelance kind of on the side thing while I was still in school.
Yeah. Do you remember what the like first Linux project was, because I think that's funny that like we all eat, sleep, and breathe like the web now, but like that wasn't even really a thing probably.
Yeah, no, I mean, I don't think I did anything with Linux in terms of writing any software or anything like that. That was just like I wanted to install it and just kind of see it
Okay,
kind of
got
up
you.
and
Just kind
running.
of playing with it
I think
almost.
I wrote my first, yeah, I think my first thing was an MS-DOS tool, which I wrote, I think, in Turbo Pascal, actually. But it was a little script that would run when the computer started up, and it would, and there's hundreds of these out there now, but back then it would basically, I built a database of everybody's birthdays and anniversaries and things in my family. And when the computer would start up, it would figure out what the current date was, and it would look through the list of all of these upcoming things and tell me when like the next birthday was and stuff like that. So I would not miss my siblings and my cousins and things like that, birthdays and stuff like that.
Yeah, I mean that's great because like all of that like personalization and calendars and stuff, it's just like everyone has that now, but that was like definitely new. That's pretty awesome. So I want to do kind of like a short little segment, and then we'll kind of jump back into some of the side projects and some of that other stuff. But I want to kind of just go through a couple terms, and it'll be like a competition almost. So I'll say like one or the other, and then you basically like say what your sense of both of them are, and kind of like what the differences are, which ones are like more or less valuable. So the first one would be kind of the difference of makers versus indie hackers, because I know you kind of like overlap in both those almost.
Yeah, I mean, I think indie hackers just have more of a focus on making money, and versus a maker, I think, who just kind of has this passion for doing their craft and just kind of creating things, and the financial outcome isn't the only reason for that to happen. So I think it kind of depends on where you are in your life, in your cycle, whether you want to be a maker or whether you want to be an indie hacker. And yeah, so I think they both have their place. Absolutely. I tell people I'm more of a maker, less of an indie hacker, mostly just because I have a full-time job that I'm really happy with. And so I don't really, most of my side projects, I don't really need to turn, I don't need them to make money and make enough money where it can become my main work or anything like that as well.
Okay. And so then ideas versus execution.
So, I mean, I don't really fall in the camp where either is the be all and end all. I know there's some people say ideas are worthless, and some people say execution's everything, and then you kind of flip things the sort of other way around as well. I think it's definitely the combination of the two that you kind of have to find that works for you, because an idea is worthless if you don't execute on it, but trying to execute a really bad idea is next to impossible as well. So yeah, you've got to have a good idea and then execute it well. Obviously, you can take a bad idea and somehow execute it to where it's worth something, and you can have a really good idea and execute poorly, and it won't be worth anything either. So that's why I think you've got to find this good mix of ideas and execution. And I think one of the things that people forget about is this whole idea of like the founder product fit, and I think that's where the idea kind of lands as well. So because you've got to find the idea that works for you as well, because it could be a really good idea, but if it's not something that you're in a place to be able to execute on, it's not going to make any difference as well.
And so then have you seen in some of your projects, like you probably have some sense of like what's a good idea or like what's a bad idea. Does your sense of which ones are going to resonate with people align with kind of the actual traction that you find that they get?
I mean, that's tough because it just depends. So sometimes they're just external factors that you have no control over, whether they reach the audience that you're expecting to, and and then they just kind of click with the audience out there. I think normally when I'm focusing on the idea part of things, it's more about like, am I the right person to execute this idea even, right? Like, do I have all of the skills that are needed to be able to execute this idea? Or do I know the people that I would be able to pull in to be able to execute this idea?
Mm-hmm.
And then also, do I have the time for the idea as well? Because it could be a really good idea, but it means that you need to spend 60 hours a week on it for the next month, or 6 months, or whatever it is. But if you know you're not going to have that time to be able to execute on that, then it could be a really fantastic idea, but it's just not something that you can execute on either.
Totally. Well, and I mean, that's like something that Cortland has mentioned about indie hackers specifically too, is that he was able to do that because he knew that he kind of needed to focus on ideas that were like less programming heavy, because he would just get like almost too much in the weeds. So that kind of, I think, leads right into our next one, which we've kind of touched on a little bit, but product founder fit versus product market fit.
Yeah, I mean, again, obviously the sort of two are important, but I think for me, especially as a maker indie hacker, I think product market maker product fit, I think, is even more important, mostly because you're just in terms of finding the energy and finding the motivation to work on things is really hard, because you come home from an 8-hour day or whatever it is that you're doing, or even if you're still at school for 8 hours, whatever it is that you're doing, you're studying, to have the energy to kind of say, okay, I'm going to start another 3-4 hours where I'm going to work on stuff. I think having good, founder product fit makes that a lot easier. Like, because it's something that you're excited to work on. It's something that you're really interested in. I think you're going to have the energy to kind of work on it. If you're just picking a product because it's, it sounds cool and there's lots of other people working in the space, and it's something that you think will have a good audience and stuff. And it may well do that, but are you going to have the motivation to actually work on it? And so I think that's where that kind of becomes a lot more important for kind of indie hackers as well.
Well, and that's been my experience too, is like you're more likely to kind of stick with something and like try harder and like do better work if it is like something that you're even like loosely interested in, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. I think yeah, and I think that's because that's where a lot of people. I talk to a lot of people online and stuff, and that's where they tell me, "Is like, well, I just I don't have the time for this. I don't have the energy for this." I'm like, but if it was something that you were really interested in, or even like you said, even loosely interested in, instead of watching TV for 3 hours, you would sit down in front of your laptop and actually work, even if it's for half of that time.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so now the most important verses we have, and you might be a little biased as a New York resident, but New York style versus deep dish pizza.
And I haven't lived in Chicago. I have lived in New York, but I have been to Chicago and had Chicago pizza in Chicago. But I will say I'm a New York style pizza.
All right. Yeah, I'm a fan of both for sure, but they're just like so different.
Yes.
Now, before we jump into the next question, I want to pause for a minute and talk a bit about Podia. Podia is a platform for creating and hosting online courses, digital downloads, and memberships. More than that, though, Podia is a company that believes in and supports creators. They don't just build course software, they really enable people like us to do the work we love. I'm a longtime Podia user, along with a few of the guests on the show. My Podia course has directly led to thousands of email subscribers and 5 figures in revenue. As a designer, I definitely have a tendency of tweaking and perfecting everything, but most of the time that's not what actually makes a difference. Podia makes it easy to focus on creating content that's useful and valuable, rather than getting distracted by design edits or a long technical setup process. It doesn't matter if you're an expert developer or creating your first ever digital product. Podia makes it fast and easy to create something that not only looks good, but converts well. If you're listening to this podcast, you're probably working on creating something. Whether that's an app, a course, or an entirely new business, creating something out of nothing is hard, but Podia makes creation a little bit easier. They're offering 15% off for life to listeners of the Latitude podcast. To get your discount or to just learn a bit more, go to podia.com/latitude, or there's a link in the show notes. All right, let's get back to the interview. Awesome. And so kind of one of the biggest things that I'm curious to chat with you about is like, number one, just kind of like the pure output that you've had, I think is really interesting. But another aspect of it is kind of your approach to monetization. And so a little context for folks, like you have a handful of projects that are monetized that make some money. I guess like as you mentioned, your full-time job is kind of like your primary income driver. So I'm curious if you can just kind of comment on that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's one of those things where for me at least, the income is it's kind of a nice outcome if it happens. And so I don't necessarily think about. I mean, I actually maybe I'll restate that. I think about how a project might make money, but I don't necessarily implement that straight away. And because just for lots of reasons, one being that it changes the expectations, I think, in terms of when you launch something. If if your first call to action is sign up and pay me money, it changes what the kind of how people look at it and how you look at it as well. But sorry, I mean, I do think it's important to think about how a project will make money or could potentially make money at some point, because if you do want to work on something for the next 3-4 years, to make it something big, then at some point it will need to make money. Otherwise, you will not work on it for that amount of time at all. The one thing I will say is that, I mean, a lot of the projects I've done over the years, I've done with other people as well. So they're not just kind of on my own, kind of solo sat in the corner working away. And so a lot of those projects are the ones that I do focus on, like, okay, how is this going to make money? Mostly because those are the projects that people actually want to become their main job and things like that. And so I do think about those a little bit more, and we do plan the how do you make money from this as we kind of build out the MVP as well. And it has worked out well. Yeah, there's kind of a few projects that are paying people salaries, and people are working on them full time and stuff now as well.
And so you're able to kind of focus on like the more maker side of it, but you are still like enabling other folks to create like more of a business out of it, then it sounds like.
Yeah, and honestly, I mean, whilst I'm happy with my job and everything, if there was a project that really took off and became widely successful, I'd be quite happy to work on it as well. So I mean, so it's always something you keep in the back of your mind that, okay, if this project really does take off and gets lots of traction, is it something I want to work on for the next 3 or 4 years as well? And I mean, that's another reason to pick things that kind of interest you as well, because if something is going to take off, your first thought shouldn't be, okay, now what do I do with it? How do I turn this over to somebody else? Because they can get more value out of it than I can.
And so then, like, for I guess both your solo projects and your kind of like more partnership projects, what sort of like marketing do you do for those, or does that kind of like vary from project to project?
Yeah, absolutely varies from project to project. I mean, the ones I'm doing with other folks, I mean, that's usually what ends up being their kind of role and their kind of function, while I'm still working on developing the application and stuff. They'll start thinking about, okay, what's the how do we reach customers and how do we reach potential users through content marketing, social media marketing, sort of that kind of stuff. If it's a personal project, it kind of depends on what it is, but my main approach has just been to build stuff in the open. So I talk a lot about what I'm building, how I'm building it, why I'm building it, all that kind of stuff. So you end up doing content marketing, kind of social media. I tweet a lot about the things I'm working on and stuff like that as well. And then so that will naturally draw your audience in as well, in terms of if you talk about the thing that you're building, then people who are interested in that thing will hopefully find it and be kind of in the orbit when you actually finish it, and then are able to launch it as well. And then the actual launch itself, obviously there's lots of different avenues in terms of product hunt, and there's things like pay to list if you want to do it pre-launch to kind of build up an audience there as well. So there's lots of different avenues to explore on that end of things.
And so I think a lot of folks have definitely had some success with building out in the open, but there are also a lot of folks that are kind of nervous about that they may like give away their idea or some of their intellectual property. What would you say to that argument?
I would say, well, one, I mean, if you've got a truly unique idea, I probably want to hear it, but you probably won't tell me about it anyway. But yeah, I would say most of what I've built is not anything new. And I think most of what people are building these days really isn't anything new. Yeah, you might have one little teeny bit of it that is new. But then talk about everything else. Like, you don't have to talk about the little secret sauce that you're working on, but you can still talk about all the other things that you're doing. Even talking about what it looks like is enough to kind of have people interested in kind of things like that. So even if the technology is really top secret and proprietary and things, there's other aspects of what you're doing and how you're doing it that you can talk about as well. But you know, and frankly, if you are building something that is so unique and custom, one, you should probably have a pattern on it or something that's going to stop other people anyway. And you know, the sort of other part of it is, at some point you're going to have to talk about what it is that you built, right? So whether you're doing it pre-launch or post-launch, at some point you have to talk about it so that people can find out about it and people can become customers or whatever. So at some point people are going to be able to see it and clone it and make their own version of it and stuff like that as well. And yeah, maybe you're afraid about giving up your lead or whatever it is, but if you execute well and the idea is good, I don't think it matters what people try and do after the fact.
Mm-hmm. And so one thing that like I definitely find difficult is I feel like my ideas do have to be really unique. And so I guess kind of you've even said that like a lot of your products are not that unique. Do you just kind of like create, or like is that something you've ever faced, or like how do you move past that?
I see. I don't. My focus is on problems, and so I don't necessarily think about what's a cool idea or what's a cool thing to build. I tend to focus on, I'm feeling this pain, I'm feeling this thing, or this information is lacking, or it's not in an easy way to access it, whatever it happens to be. And so yeah, so my focus is typically, what's the pain and how do I solve that pain? And so ideas are nice because, you know, they give you a way to solve that problem, but the idea isn't the thing that I'm building, or the idea isn't the end point, right? Like, it's the solution of the problem that's the end point. And so whether it's unique or not doesn't really mean that much to me, because it's, if it's not a unique solution, but I'm still solving a different problem using a solution that somebody built over there, I'm still solving a unique problem now. And so I think you can look at it from that way, in that I'm solving a unique pain, or I'm finding a unique way to solve a pain that exists out there for people that hasn't been solved in the past as well. So you're still doing something new and original. You're just thinking about it from the pain perspective instead of the sort of idea perspective, in that, yes, it might be an existing idea, but if nobody's applied it in this way in this industry, then it's still something new. And so that's one way to do it. I don't worry too much about new and unique anymore. You know, just because, you know, having worked in this industry for so long, that you kind of come to realize that the first mover advantage really isn't that big an advantage. You know, like, Facebook wasn't the first social media platform. Google wasn't the first search platform. Microsoft wasn't even the first operating system. Apple's not the first company to put out a mobile phone. But, you know, you solve a unique problem in a unique way. It doesn't matter if you're the first or the 100th person. If you do it in the right way, people will. Yeah, it might take you a little bit longer, but people will still find it, and you will still have something that is successful.
Well, and I think too, if you look at like the bootstrapper or like smaller, that kind of like software long tail, obviously there's even like countless more examples that aren't like the first thing. And so I think that little shift of like if some person is feeling some specific problem, like if you can solve that, you should solve that. It's not a matter of if it's new or unique. It's like, why wouldn't you solve that problem almost?
Yeah, and I think you kind of also have to think about starting small, right? Like you can't solve the world's problem as an indie hacker, right? Like because you just don't have the resources and the time or anything to kind of do those things. So to find a completely unique way to solve the power crisis, I'm not going to invent fusion power here, but if I can find a way to improve a widget so it makes somebody's life 10%, it improves somebody's life by 10%, that's often the best way to get started, because then once you've got that foothold in there as an indie hacker, it gives you the opportunity then to expand out and to build more cool and interesting things. But to get that foothold, because chances are that you're not raising money of any kind in terms of trying to figure out how to pay people salary. You're basically having to get people to pay you for your product so that you can work on it full time. And so you need to be able to charge almost immediately for these things. So if you can solve a problem immediately, you can start to generate income immediately, which means that you have more time to spend on that thing and then expand on it as well. So that's the other thing with kind of indie hackers, I think, that you have to keep in mind. Yeah, and again, it kind of goes back a little bit to the whole, I don't want to share my ideas. I don't want to share my what I'm working on. It's just going to take you longer to get to market at that point, because you're going to spend 6 months building something in private, and then you got to build the marketing engine to kind of be able to ramp up to actually sign up customers and all that kind of stuff. Versus if you're building in the public, by the time you're ready to launch, you've already got an audience, you've already got people lined up, hopefully, to be able to be able to become a customer as well, so that then you can kind of up to things even faster. And so I think it's important to kind of align, with where you are and kind of where you're kind of heading, kind of all kind of at the same time, instead of trying to think about, well, I want to be unique and that'll make me stand out. The way that the internet works these days, it's not going to make you stand out. Everybody has their own little spin on things anyway.
And so it sounds like even outside of kind of that desire to like scale up or grow or monetize, you've clearly found like tons of other benefits outside of the projects that you work on. So I'm curious to kind of hear what you see some of those biggest benefits to be.
Yeah, I mean, when I really started to get back into the maker movement and the indie hacker movement, it was mostly just, well, one, I was working for an agency at the time, and we were doing lots of really cool stuff, lots of really interesting work, but we were all under NDA and we couldn't talk about what we were doing. We couldn't even talk about who we were doing it for and all this kind of stuff. And so for me, joining the maker movement was a lot about, well, let me just make something cool and fun on the side, and then I can talk about that instead. And so it was a way for me to kind of share some of the things that I could do and I was doing, without necessarily having to talk about what stuff I was actually working on. So it really helped me to kind of establish myself as somebody who could make things and could do really cool things online, without necessarily having to worry about violating NDAs and things. But yeah, so I mean, for me, the main benefit was just to grow my network. And I think that's a really important thing that a lot of people don't really like to do. They kind of, because most developers want to focus on writing code and to releasing software. But, at some point you need to have a network of people that you can reach out to because you're stuck on stuff or because you have a new idea. They may be able to help you, kind of things like that, which, people don't, I mean, a lot of people are introverts, but just like, even if you're not an introvert, I think people are just afraid of reaching out to people and kind of things like that. And that was absolutely my case as well. I'm now more of an extrovert, but I'm still very much an introvert as well. But over the years, it's become a little bit easier to kind of do all of that. But yeah, so it's obviously helped me in terms of growing my audience on social media as well. I got lots of followers now and lots of people who are interested to kind of hear about the things I'm working on as well.
Well, and I'll definitely mirror a lot of that because like I absolutely love doing these interviews. But I'm exhausted after them, like just because I am introverted, like I'm tired after that. And so I think it's interesting that you found a way almost to use that to your advantage where like you're using coding and you're using kind of that stuff to connect with people.
Yeah, it's funny. I was thinking earlier. I was trying to plan out some of my marketing and my sales effort. I was like, well, I should write more blog posts, and I should talk about more about things that I'm working on and things things that I see other people they just write a blog post a week and to day sometimes. I'm just like, well, I don't like to do that. Like normally when I write a blog post, it's because I've launched something. And so I write about the thing that I've launched. And I think part of it is that whole kind of still being an introvert. I don't really like to talk about just random things, but having launched a side project, it gives me that natural output now. Okay, from the coding side and from the making side, I can talk about what I just accomplished and kind of what I just achieved, which seems to make it a little bit easier for me, at least, to focus on. Well, this is the things that I like to do, and then so I can write about that rather than just trying to magic up stuff to kind of share out there instead.
And yeah, and I mean for me too, like I've tried the weekly newsletter thing, I've tried the like weekly blog post thing. And I mean it's worked to some extent, but like it doesn't fit well with my personality. And like even besides that, like the biggest spikes I've seen in the growth of my my email list have been like just other random things that I wanted to do that were kind of outside of that. And so then I think we've kind of talked about a lot about like how to keep it fun, how to kind of like work on things that you want to work on. But obviously there's like a dichotomy there where like if you are trying to monetize that, like it can be stressful. Like if you have bills to pay or you don't have like a full-time job that you're content with. And so what would you kind of say to folks that are trying to kind of build that business into something that they can live off of, and feel like they're not able to focus on kind of those other fun, random things?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think the idea is just to start small, right? Like, don't try and there's a number of people I know who tell me that they've been working for like a year on their side project or something like that, and they haven't launched yet. I have to put my hands up and say like, why? Like we absolutely, you want it to be polished and perfect and all that kind of fun stuff, but until you've launched it, you've got no opportunity to kind of get feedback from customers, to get money from customers, or any of that kind of stuff as well. And so, yeah, so my solution is always, cut back to the bare minimum. What's that one feature? What's that one thing that you can launch? And I think that goes back a little bit too in terms of like the original idea as well. It's like you do have to think about, what's the thing that somebody working on their own can do in a few weeks, in a few, in weekends and evening time as well. So you can't take on those big, massive challenges that would take a team of people weeks and months to kind of work on as well. And it's just that step up as well, right? Like, what's the thing that you can start with, but then, what's the thing that you can then, now that you've made that first step, what's the next step as well, rather than, well, that's the end of it. And then I think that's where kind of some people get stuck as well. But start small and think about how, or even if you have a big idea, that's absolutely fantastic, because that's where you want to be in 5 or 6 years, right? But how do you take the first step on that idea? You can't wait 5 or 6 years you can't start at the end. You got to start at the beginning. So what's that first step that you're going to take to accomplish that?
And so do you personally have like a process that you use to both like figure out what that small version is and then also to execute on it?
I don't know if I have a formal process, but absolutely. I mean, I sit down and I think about what's the unique selling proposition of this idea. So I guess, for example, the idea, so I built this thing called Q with some friends from England, and Q is a social media sharing platform, where we kind of have I guess now they have a bunch of experts who curate content in different categories, and then you as a user can sign up and say, I'm interested in marketing, or I'm interested in sales, or I'm interested in web development, and we can recommend you, here's X number of posts each day that you can share on your social media account, so your account looks like it's got interesting stuff on it. And so when Matt and Dan came to me with the idea originally, they wanted to build out like the whole suite of stuff. So they wanted to build our own content scheduler, they wanted to build our curation platform, and then a way to kind of share that stuff automatically as well. So it was this big idea, big plan of to kind of create the whole thing. And so when I spoke to Matt and Dan about it, I was like, well, that's great, but that would probably take us 6 months to build, right? Because it would just take us that long to build all the different pieces that we would need to build to kind of make that work. What we ended up doing was we ended up using Puffer has an API that allows you basically to kind of do all of the sharing for you on all the different platforms, on Facebook and Twitter and all those kind of things as well. So we leveraged their API to kind of handle like the stuff that we didn't really care about. Like we don't actually care about the mechanism of sharing, isn't what the value of the company was, right? The value of the company was to find the content for you that you could then share. So the fact that we weren't going to spend weeks working on writing a content scheduler and integrating with Facebook and Twitter and all those other social media platforms, it saved us a whole bunch of time. And we could actually focus on the stuff which was finding content and finding the experts who were experts in those spaces, and kind of making the experience for them really easy to submit the content, which then could be shared out instead. So instead of spending 6 months on this whole big thing, we ended up building in about 2 weeks was our like internal version to make sure it all worked. I think the MVP took about 4 weeks, I think it was instead. So instead of spending 6 months, we spent 4 weeks instead.
So, I mean, and it totally goes back to figuring out what that problem is.
Yes.
Rather than just kind of like building something.
Yeah, and it's, I think I talk about this a lot, but it's like finding the best use of your time. As a indie hacker, as a maker on the side, you've only got 1 or 2 hours a night at most. If you were going to be working a full-time job, then you've got 8 to 10 hours a day to kind of experiment with stuff and see what works and what isn't working and all that kind of fun stuff. But as a maker, you've got, like I said, at most, you've got 1 or 2 hours a day, maybe 6 or 8 hours on the weekend, depending on if you have a family or not. So even there, it's like, how can you best use the time that you have?
Well, and so that kind of like totally leads into another question that I wanted to ask you is like, I think I've seen personally that by limiting those things, whether there's like a real limit or not, that I'm able to be productive, I'm able to get more done, and I'm able to focus on the right things, like you kind of mentioned. And so I think there's a way to almost like create those limitations for yourself, whether it is like a full-time job or a family or just kind of like something that you put on yourself.
Yeah, no, I think it's really good. I mean, I know personally, and this changes a little bit from project to project, but I try, and if I have again, this is kind of a fun side project idea, not something that's going to be a company that's going to take over the world or anything, but if it's an idea that I think I can execute, I think I want to build, I normally limit myself to about 2 weeks and say, I need to have the MVP ready in 2 weeks. And I think it just goes back to what you said. It's like, well, what's the most important things that I need to build in those 2 weeks? Even if it takes me a little bit longer, I know I've already pinned down, well, this is the core set of features that I know I need to build. And if it takes me 3 weeks, okay, it takes me 3 weeks, that's fine. But I know I've been listening to the 37 Signals folks as well, talk about their 6 weeks cycle of kind of how they think about adding new features onto Basecamp and stuff. I think it's the same idea, right? Like in terms of yes, we've got enough money that we can we can work for as long as we want to on things, but at some point you've got to ship stuff. And rather than shipping stuff every 3 months or shipping stuff every year or whatever it is that you want to do, they have 6-week cycles. And I think that's really an interesting constraint that they put on themselves when they clearly have no need to put any kind of constraints on themselves either. Just so that you can force the creative mind to actually say, what's the thing that we should actually work on? What's the thing that we can actually do while we're still excited about that idea as well? Because I think that's the other thing, that when you don't have the time constraint, the longer you get away from when you start something to when you launch it, your excitement level is going to come down and down and down and down. And after a month, if you're still excited about something, it's going to be pretty rare, I think.
Yeah, and I'll definitely drop in the show notes the Shape Up book, which kind of goes a lot more into that. And I think it's interesting too, because compared to like the 2-week like Scrum or Agile sprints, like it doesn't have the craziness of that, but it also doesn't have the open-endedness of, okay, I'm going to work on this forever, basically. Which is like every like weekly newsletter or blog or things like that. It's like so open-ended. And so I think having those constraints can be super valuable.
Yeah, it's really, I mean, my daughters are really into art, and so they like to draw and paint and stuff like that. And it was funny, I was talking to the art teacher that my kids have, and I don't know how we came onto this particular topic, but one of the things that she taught, and I think I've heard it kind of elsewhere as well, but she was saying how in some art colleges and stuff like that, they will actually actively put constraints on you as an artist as well. So they would say, I want you to paint a sunset, but you can only use the color black. Things like that. So it's like, well, even as an artist, you can put constraints on yourself because it makes you think about things and approach things in a new way. And so, because if you can use the reds and the yellows and those kinds of colors, then everybody's sunset looks exactly the same, right? But now, if you can only use a specific color or a specific medium, now everybody needs to approach things in a slightly different way. So having that constraint actually makes you more creative in kind of lots of ways. And I think that's kind of what I like about that too, is having that 2 weeks. It's like you have to get a little bit creative in terms of what can I leave out and what's the thing that I need to actually work on as well.
Well, and I mean, I think it like almost makes you more aware of some of the things outside of like the work and the features too. Like when you are kind of cutting it down, you have to be aware of like your family and your like responsibilities and like your hobbies, which like obviously making is a hobby, but like there are other things too.
Well, yeah, and that's true for me. And a lot of the projects that I make are because of my other hobbies as well. Like I've made sites that are about football, soccer in this country, also about movies. I'm a big MCU fan. I like to watch all those superhero movies as well. But so I built sites that are kind of related to all of those as well. So having that tie-in kind of actually does it kind of feeds back on the energy as well. And now I'm even more excited to watch the next movie or to watch the next match. And then that kind of feeds on itself as well.
And so I think another way that it ties in on, and like something that you've talked about, is you've mentioned kind of with your stutter and like with kind of moving to different countries, that's obviously had an impact on your life. But you've kind of talked about how that's like impacted your business and like your work as a maker as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think as a maker, probably the second most mentioned, I don't want to say excuse, but it is an excuse, I think, is that people get a little bit afraid of, I don't want to launch this yet because it's not ready, and I don't want people to say that I did a bad job, or people just hate my idea, or they hate my project and kind of things like that. And I mean, partly it's an excuse, and partly it's just it's a valid fear as well, that people want valid presentation of their ideas and kind of and their work as well. But yeah, having been, somebody who moved to a new country when I was 4, having developed a stutter when I moved, I went through school and kids, they were pretty nice, but you had the kids who weren't very nice about my stuttering and things like that too. I think it just kind of helped me develop a slightly thicker skin, just in terms of, people saying things and things like that. And then as I became a maker too, I think that thicker skin kind of helps me a little bit, because it's not that you don't value people's opinions, but I think you kind of think about who is saying it a little bit more. And you think about things that they're saying and why they're saying them. And I think that kind of feeds a little bit in terms of, just kind of how you kind of internalize that as well. Like, is it really valid feedback that maybe it is a bad idea, right? Like, and it's okay if somebody says it's a bad idea and they know more about that industry than you do. And so you do have to think about who is saying it and why they're saying it. Versus, just some random person on the internet told me this is a bad idea, so it must be a bad idea, but I think, so having that thicker skin, which I developed, through, some part of my stuttering, I think I kind of helped me not react immediately, but actually consider what was being said and why it was being said. And I think you do, because I think feedback is a hugely important part of what we do, because ultimately we're building things for other people. And so understanding what they think of the idea, why they think it's good, why they think it's bad is hugely important too. So you can't always just, feel really bad just because somebody says it's bad, but, understand why they're saying it and understanding how you could improve things as well.
Well, and I think it's something that like comes with business and life experience, that like most people are like very kind of in their own heads, like focused on their own problems. Obviously, like my experience is the only experience I've ever gone through. Like your experience is the only experience you've ever gone through. And I think it kind of just like makes you more aware of that. And that can like make you a more effective maker, because you do take the time to kind of think about like, what is their perspective? What is that kind of like challenge that I'm solving? Or like if they're providing negative feedback, like what does that say about like the whole situation more than me personally?
Yeah, and I think the other thing that you have to keep in mind is, so sometimes you do have to just remember that sometimes people will just be having a bad day as well, right? It's not always that these are bad people and they're doing bad things just for the sake of doing bad things. Sometimes, you can just catch somebody at the wrong time. Because I've had plenty of instances where my stuttering has not been an issue at all with people, with friends and family and things like that. And just some day, because just like you said, they've got their own things happening in their own lives and things like that. My stuttering just ticked them off for some reason. And that's, and like I said, you kind of develop the thicker skin a little bit to understand that it's not always you. It is sometimes, but it's not always you. And you just kind of have to appreciate that, that it and I think that happens to everybody. It's not just people with stutters and things like that, but it happens to people with obstacles a little bit more. So you kind of experience it a little bit more as well. I think in some ways it has also, I see the obstacle. So in some cases I kind of make myself, like even doing things like this podcast and things, like I make myself do these things sometimes because I want to overcome the sort of my kind of in my head that I've got this issue with speaking. So doing things like this, I think is helpful for me. And so I end up like, I think, even a few years back, it was like, well, I want to be at a conference. I want to speak at conference, sort of on the stage. And so I put out a bunch of, there was a bunch of, call for speakers, and I just went ahead and applied to a few of those. And then so I was picked for a few as well. So it was great. And then I had to actually speak on stage, but, which was not so great, but even just knowing that those obstacles exist, it kind of makes you kind of open up a little bit more, I think.
Yeah, and so I mean, it's just a matter of like turning those challenges into like something that pushes you towards growth.
Right.
And so I want to kind of shift it for the last kind of handful of minutes that we have. The biggest project I've seen you've been working on lately is Pod Hunt. So why don't you kind of talk a little bit about that, and sort of like what your learnings have been from that so far?
Sure. Yeah. So Pod Hunt is an application that's trying to solve the problem of podcast d- discovery. I've been a big podcast listener for probably 10 years now. As I listen to podcasts, I realize that there's just more podcasts out there as well. I think the last count was that there's something like 850,000 podcasts. I think it was about 450,000 active podcasts as well. So even if people are putting out a new episode a week, that's still 500,000 new episodes a week.
Crazy.
So, which is insane. And so finding the good ones to listen to or to find the ones that you're going to be interested in is still a really hard thing. And so a lot of the ways that people find podcasts now is just the kind of they look at the leaderboards that are out there about what's popular and what's not. And the problem with those is that they're all the same and they all stay the same week after week and month after month. So what Pod Hunt does is, rather than focusing on a podcast as a whole, it says, well, let's focus on an individual episode. Is this an episode that somebody will like? Is this an episode that has somebody on it that you will like? Sort of those kind of things. So what we have is a daily leaderboard where people can log onto the site and submit a new episode that other users can then upvote as well and say that was a good episode, or if it wasn't, they can just not upvote it as well. And then so every day when you visit Pod Hunt, you get something new, something fresh that you may or may not like. But the sort of upvotes will kind of help tell you if it's a good episode or not, and hopefully you'll find something new and interesting.
Great. And I mean, it seems like it's also been kind of a good example of starting from something small. It sounded like you got the initial version out pretty quick, and then I've definitely been seeing you kind of add on and build new features as you go.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it was thinking about what's the core feature, right? The core feature was let people submit stuff, let people upvote stuff, and that was it. That was the core feature. And then, I think when I launched it, it was just about episodes. A podcast never had their own page, things like that. So it was like purely thinking about the core feature of the application and kind of what could I do. It basically, a user could sign in, user could submit an episode, a user could upvote the episodes, and that was the MVP essentially. And then, since then, I've added profile pages for the podcast. I've added profile pages for the users as well, so you can see what people have upvoted, what people, what episodes people have been on as well, and hosts and guests and kind of things like that as well. I think we've added the ability for users to upload a preview of an episode as well, so you can kind of listen to a 30-second clip of the episode as well, so you can hear if it might be something that interests you as well. So just thinking about what's the minimum features that you need to launch so that people can start interacting with it. And then thinking about, okay, now that we've got that bit working in the middle, what's the other things that will really help people achieve what the outcome is that we're kind of hoping for, which is to how can users find episodes that they're going to really enjoy as well.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and I'll definitely drop Pod Hunt in the show notes, and you can also probably find this episode on Pod Hunt sometime in the future.
Absolutely.
Are there other places that folks should go to check out kind of what you're working on, what you're doing, and just like learn a little bit more?
Yeah, mostly I'm pretty active on Twitter, so it's just twitter.com/Mubashar Iqbal. I'm sure you'll link to it in the show notes.
Yep.
And then I'm pretty active on Indie Hackers as well. I share a lot of the milestones that I've achieved with Pod Hunt and kind of things like that too. So, and it's just Indie Hackers, and then my username is actually on that. I think it's just Mubs is my username on Indie Hackers.
All right, awesome. Yeah, and I try to kind of tune into Indie Hackers every once in a while as well. And so kind of the question that I ask everyone to kind of wrap up the episodes, how do you define latitude in your life and in your business?
I think the latitude that I like is just being able to do things the way that I want to. And for me, it started, I would say, in the summer of 2000 when I started working out of my house. So for 18, nearly 19 years now, I've been working remotely from what was my apartment and now is my house. And so having that flexibility of both my schedule and to be able to build my own way of working, I think that's kind of formed a lot of what I do now in the indie hacker space and the maker space as well. Just to have that freedom to kind of explore and analyze things in the way that I want to, not too worried about how other people think things should work and kind of things like that. And I think, like I said, it started with that, not having to commute to a job every day, and then it just kind of opened my eyes that just because other people are doing things a certain way doesn't mean that I have to as well.
Well, thank you so much, Mubs. It's been great having you with us here, and I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on. It's been a fun conversation.
Thanks for tuning in. So here's how Latitude works. It's the full interview you just finished listening to. Then next time, I'll break down some of the topics and themes we just discussed. This short, focused, and extremely actionable episode goes even deeper into some of what we've covered today. Make sure to hit subscribe to get that and other upcoming interviews. This is also the part of the show where I'm supposed to ask you to rate and review the podcast. Instead, I want to make you a little more actionable about applying some of the things we've talked about today. So send a tweet, message, email, or carrier pigeon to a friend about the one thing you learned and how you'll apply it to your business this week. Or send it to me on Twitter at Zavzen. Links and more are in the show notes at createlatitude.com/podcast. And I just want to remind you that you already have the tools you need to create a little more latitude in your day, your business, and your life.